Welcome to On the Way, a podcast about life. But not just any life, it's about life with Jesus. Why do people follow Jesus, and how do they get started? And what difference does following Jesus make in their lives? Before Christians had a name, they were known as people of the way, people who followed Jesus' teachings. People have been on the way for nearly 2,000 years now. During the podcast, we explore the ways that people become followers of Jesus and why, and what difference following Jesus makes in their lives. On the Way is produced by the Baptist Standard, a donor-supported provider of news, opinion, and resources for living like Jesus. I'm Eric Black, editor of the Baptist Standard. I'm glad you're with us today. We have with us today Jesse Loper. Jesse and I, we've known each other for, about 15 or so years. When my wife and I were in college ministry in New Mexico, Jesse was a student at the University of New Mexico, and so we've known each other since then, and it's great to be able to reconnect with you, Jesse. You've gone in one direction geographically, we've gone in another direction geographically, but yet here we are talking to each other online. So Jesse, thank you for being with us today.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Jesse, you and I have talked a little bit about the podcast and the focus questions. How did you become a follower of Jesus, and what difference does following Jesus make in your life? So how did you become a follower of Jesus?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I grew up going to church in vitro, right? So I was a little bitty boy. Grew up going to church in Oklahoma City, and we went to Olivet Baptist Church, and in fact, it was at that little church in Oklahoma City where I decided to become a follower of Jesus at a young age. I remember my dad; he certainly was more concerned about it than anybody, in the sense that I was so young, and I decided, hey, Dad, I want to follow Jesus. And I remember having these really long conversations, which of course, when you are 6 years old and 7 years old, that was the harder part, was having to go for these long conversations with your parents about why you want to follow Jesus, as opposed to making the decision to follow Jesus. I think it was part of who I was. Now, of course, I think for me, as a 6 and 7 year old, people say, hey, did you really understand what that meant? Mm-hmm. And I think the easy answer is no, of course not. I would also say that even if I was, 36, would I understand what it meant? The answer would be no, right? So I think it's a journey, and that's kind of essentially how my journey started, at least, is in a Baptist church in Oklahoma City.
All right. What were your parents doing at the time?
Yeah, so my parents. So my dad is a doctor by training, and he stopped practicing medicine, and when I was, I think probably around 4 or 5 years old, and basically he and my mom became home missionaries with the old home mission board, and
yep.
And my dad would go around. Yeah, exactly. Back in the day. I went to their commissioning ceremony in Atlanta, and all of that as little children, my sister and I did. And so my dad had left practicing medicine and ended up kind of becoming a consultant / medical missionary for the entire United States. And so he would travel along with my mom and do all sorts of things, between helping churches start clinics and find ways to serve those that were in need of medical care, and also did some AIDS education, because of course back at that time there were a lot of folks that were terrified as to what it meant, what AIDS meant, what it meant to have somebody maybe who was HIV positive in their congregation, and just do a lot of education on that front. And it's one thing to hear it from the news or from a pastor, but I think there was some level of kind of reassurance that congregations felt from hearing a doctor explain, hey, look, it's okay. If somebody has AIDS and comes into your church, welcome them, give them a hug, right? So they are God's children, and this is the reason why you should welcome them as well. So he kind of did a huge, a large diversity of things for the Home Mission Board back in the day.
Okay. So after you became a follower of Christ, you're young, and you weren't entirely sure what it meant, but you were pretty sure at the time you knew what it meant. Where did following Jesus take you from that point? You know, you're young, 6, 7 years old, and you're starting out. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I would go back to what my parents taught me, right? I would say that God and following Jesus had a lot more to do with what you do outside of church than it ever does with going to church, right? So for my family, if we weren't doing something at the church, and by doing something, I don't necessarily mean going to a church service or Sunday school even, but really giving back, whether that's taking food to folks or delivering some sort of service, working with children. If we weren't doing those things, we weren't following Christ. And I think that's sort of the path that I went on, even in high school. I remember in high school, I even though my dad wasn't my Sunday school teacher, I was so tired of Sunday school. I was like, I got to do something else. I felt like, hey, I've heard enough Sunday school lessons, right, at 16 and 17. So then I was like, Dad, yeah, so I really like your Sunday school class, but I'm going to go teach the 5-year-olds Sunday school because that just felt more like what I wanted to do. So I was still in Sunday school, but I got to do more coloring at that point in time. But I also got to do more service, right? So I think for me, that was what church was not sitting still. In fact, even my wife, still to this day, when we go to church, she's like, Jesse, why can't you sit still? And she knows as well as I do.
I remember that about you. Uh-huh.
Yeah, I've never sat still. So, it's not really my thing. So, so I would say sitting in the church pew is probably one of my least favorite parts of going to church. But I do love being in church with other folks serving.
We're going to take a sponsor break, and we'll be right back.
Since 1952, South Texas Children's Home Ministries has focused on healing hearts and sharing hope. Their 9 ministries focus on helping hurting children and families, all regardless of an individual's ability to pay. To find out more, visit www.stchm.org.
You said that following Jesus is a lot more about what you do outside of the 4 walls of the church than necessarily what you do inside the 4 walls. So when you were in high school, you were a wrestler. When you came to UNM, you were studying political science and Spanish, right?
That's right.
Yeah. And from what I recall, you were almost fluent in Spanish. I mean, you did pretty well. How did that kind of thing factor into, or I guess, how did you pair following Jesus, serving the church, and the things that you were doing outside of church?
Yeah, I mean, so one thing speaking of growing up, right? So one of the reasons I wanted to learn Spanish, for me at least, was as I was growing up, my parents intentionally, I went to school, my sister and I, that was a really diverse school. We had students from everywhere, where being monolingual was probably more unique than being bilingual. So we had students from all over Latin America, a lot of Vietnamese and Laotian students, and just a great diversity of students. And so I remembered being on the high school soccer team, and there was my senior year, I think there was myself and then one other white guy, and we were the only ones who didn't speak 2 languages, right? So everybody else either spoke Spanish and English, or Vietnamese and English, or Laotian English, or what have you. And I think for me, it was important to understand that, hey, if you really want to reach folks, you got to learn how to speak their language. And that's in a very literal sense. So I won't lie, my Spanish has dropped off in my years of lawyering sense, but it is something that I can pick back up. And I think there's such value to that finding ways to serve folks in their language and understanding that, hey, when you speak a mother tongue to someone, you're speaking to their heart in a different way, right? So in an adopted language is a whole different thing. And now that I'm married to my wife, she speaks multiple languages, and I'm even further aware of what it means to speak to someone's heart, right, in that sense. And so I would say, like, continue to figure out how to serve and speak someone's language within that space has been something that's been important to me, because I see the difference it makes when someone's eyes brighten up and they hear their own language, right? So
there's a connection too. Are you learning any of the languages that your wife speaks?
Well, much to her
Is she
chagrin.
Teaching you?
That assumes I'm teachable, right? So
okay. Yeah, well, hey.
I would say I have enough phrases to get myself into. I don't know that I have enough phrases to get myself out of trouble, but I definitely have enough phrases to get myself into trouble. So it's been a journey.
Well, you do that in English anyway, so
it's funny how that works, isn't it? So multilingual troublemaker, I think, is probably what she would call me. So, but luckily. A little bit of language can go a long ways as long as it comes from a place of sincerity, I think. So.
Okay. All right. We'll leave it at that. Yeah. When you were at UNM studying political science, how did you come to that degree, and what were you envisioning yourself doing with that?
That's a good question, and the answer is probably I don't know on both fronts, really.
Okay.
I think it was that reality where I went to school and thought, well, maybe I should be a doctor like my dad, and then I thought, wow, he must have done a lot more studying than I've done in life. But I think political science was something that was interesting, because I think what it showed was how political systems and how we as a society make choices, and particularly choices for those that are the poor among us, right? So how do we as a society, as a political system, figure out ways to help others, right? And how do we do that systemically, as opposed to, I think it was always important. I always think it's important for us to give and serve and find ways to certainly invite the poor into our hearts and into our lives. But I think, how do we change systems that create oppression, and how do we change those systems that are keeping folks where they are, as opposed to helping bring them along to the greater good. And so I think I always found that interesting, how societies, politicians, how citizens make those choices and why. And so that was one thing I just found really curious, kind of academically, and of course I still do. And the question is, how do you create positive change, really, for those that are hungry and those that are poor, those that are in need, and those that are homeless.
Yeah, and political science and things that you were involved in at UNM, they brought you face to face with that on a pretty regular basis. I mean, our building, the Baptist Student Union building, where it was located, we had a lot of interesting relationships with people that lived around our building and slept in the bushes and things like that.
One time, I think I went with another group. There was maybe 2 or 3 other guys, and we were giving sandwiches out, and we started praying with some other men that were living on the streets, and we were probably out there it seemed like much later than my normal bedtime. And
I'm trying to think what that was. Yeah,
and you were waiting for us in the parking lot at First Baptist Church down there in downtown Albuquerque, where we had started to begin with, because you were wanting to make sure we got back safely and things like that. And those experiences I remember, and I remember like being part of like what that meant to be the hands and the hearts and the of Jesus, right? So, and the fact that we were doing that, but you wanted to stand by us and making sure that we were still there and supporting us throughout that. So those are things I remember as far as what it meant to serve Jesus in that way in Albuquerque.
Yeah, those were good days. Yeah, we have a lot of stories about that. I'm glad you didn't tell all of them.
Exactly. Well, it is. Yeah. And for posterity's sake, I'll stop there.
Okay. We'll just leave everybody guessing.
Yeah, that's right. Exactly. Yeah. Well, stay tuned maybe for the next episode of your podcast. So
yeah, maybe so. Well, from UNM, you went to Fordham, and you studied law.
Yeah. Well, so right after UNM, I went to New York to work. I worked with a Cooperative Baptist Fellowship, partnered with them through, and ended up serving for 2 years with their Global Service Corps at Metro Baptist Church and Rauschenbusch Metro Ministries, doing services. Basically, I helped run English as second language programs and youth programs at that little nonprofit in Hell's Kitchen in New York. So I did that for a couple of years, and then decided
had a little bit of snow there one winter.
Yeah. It's New York, right? So it was. But I will say that there was a huge difference, right? I thought, hey, look, I'd grown up in a family doing urban ministry in Oklahoma City and then Albuquerque, and I was like, yeah, I'm ready for New York. And I would say those buildings are tall. And there's a lot of people in New York, so it was a cultural shift for sure. So and snow and gray, and especially coming from Albuquerque where it's just sunny all the time. So so there was a huge shift. Less on the service front and almost more on the weather and culture front. So
Yeah, man. I just remember you sending pictures of a snow storm one winter, and I think it was taller. The snow was taller than you, I think.
Anyway. It was a whole different ball game out there than what I was used to.
We're going to take a 60-second sponsor break, and we'll be right back. High Ground Advisors has a 90-year history of providing investment management and planned giving solutions to churches, faith-based organizations, and charitably minded individuals dedicated to transforming lives. High Ground is trusted by over 450 nonprofit clients, and we're one of them. High Ground has partnered with Baptist Standard for over 70 years by offering a comprehensive charitable giving and investment solutions model, which includes asset management, planned giving education and development, account support services, real estate and minerals management, and expert legal consultation. High Ground and the Baptist Standard share similar values, such as serving those who are called and dedicated to transforming lives and being a trusted caretaker of legacies. They also value good stewardship, helping those who desire to be good stewards of their financial resources to find creative giving solutions to fulfill that calling. They know what they do to protect, strengthen, and grow our mission is ultimately in service to the gospel. To learn more about how High Ground Advisors can partner with you or your organization, visit their website at highgroundadvisors.org. Well, you studied poverty law at Fordham, and I think about that, and not just anybody wants to study poverty law. So based on the things that you've described to this point, people might be able to think, okay, all right, that seems to make sense for you. What else was factoring into a decision to study that?
Well, so I mean, basically in law school, right, you don't really have a specialty so much, but I definitely took classes, right? So looking at how poverty influences basically the law and how the law influences those that are impoverished. And one of the things that I came out of law school realizing, and this is through internships and obviously my previous work experiences, the difference housing makes for people, right? So that it really doesn't matter, and how much the legal systems kind of support, unfortunately, not just the legal, but the political systems kind of help support and continue to perpetuate chronic homelessness and other issues like that. And that's what really kind of got me going in life, that no matter what, no matter who you are, in fact, I would argue no matter what side of the political spectrum you're on, it doesn't really matter. Reducing homelessness should be a goal for everybody. It's better for us as Christians. That's, hitting home to begin with. But even if you're not a Christian, from a political standpoint, from a socioeconomic standpoint, it's better for us as a society. I think for me, it was really the fight against homelessness and the fight for safe and sustainable housing for other folks was really what started to drive me. And that was through obviously my previous experiences, but then also working in housing court in New York City and doing tenants' rights things, realizing that folks were just living on the margins in so many ways. And we need to figure out a way as kind of as humans, right? And more particularly as Christians to find ways to give folks a place to lay their head at night, right? Even Jesus talked about being homeless, right? About how he had no place to lay his head. And if we're supposed to serve Jesus, I think that means we need to figure out ways to serve the homeless.
Mm. And when you finished, you ended up in Denver.
Yeah, so I got a job out of law school trying to figure out what to do when I grew up. And I think my wife and I, at least I will speak for myself, was a little tired of living on the East Coast and needed some sunshine. And I got a job at the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. And as a lawyer, so I worked in their Office of Counsel for many years and doing all sorts of manners of programs. Of course, HUD is this kind of a agency where they put an amalgamation of a variety of programs for social services and for housing and community development. So I ended up working there, doing a lot of really kind of interesting work for a while, which I definitely enjoyed. Because I found that it was important work for sure. So.
Okay. While you were at HUD in Denver, where did you find your Christian convictions being able to be expressed through the work that you were doing?
Yeah, so I mean, to me, I think, again, going back to my ideas before, is it really doesn't matter who you are or where you come from. The more housing we can provide for humanity, the more we are fulfilling our call as Christians. So, because it really doesn't, again, especially when you're looking at who is homeless and why folks are homeless. And one of the things I think that fueled me was especially HUD's programs that were kind of more integrated, right? So doing stuff where it was not just housing, but providing supportive care as well. Because anybody who's worked with the homeless for long understands that a lot of the folks that live on the streets, the reason they're on the streets isn't necessarily because they've chosen to be on the streets. It could be a wide variety of things, and many of whom are struggling with mental illness and other psychiatric disorders. And I think it's a full picture of services that we need, especially coming from a family where my dad was a doctor, realizing that folks that are homeless are not just experiencing housing instability, they're also experiencing severe medical problems, right? That's a physical, psychiatric, a wide variety of things. And the more we can do to help folks in that full spectrum of services, the better we can do as society and really as Christians.
Yeah, homelessness is a cluster of things, and it can be causative or it can be an outcome.
Absolutely, right. And the question is, what can we do to help alleviate the suffering of others, right? So I think it's always important to remember, right? We all remember the Good Samaritan, but I think the question really that was answering was, who is my neighbor, right? And the answer is the folks who you don't expect to be your neighbor, right? And I think that's the challenge for us. And if we're not challenged by that, if we don't have neighbors that challenge us, and we're not challenging ourselves to serve someone different than ourselves, then I wonder if we're fulfilling our call as Christians.
On that front, homelessness and finding homes for people, where are Christians getting it right? Where are you seeing some good work being done?
Yeah, I think anytime we are loving folks, right? So we're doing something well, right? Where we are we're giving to someone who doesn't need something. I mean, who maybe doesn't, in a better way, doesn't, quote, deserve it, right, by our standards, by our societal standards. So I think anytime you've seen a church give to someone who's in need, that would not otherwise have received that. You're stepping into the shoes of Jesus at that point in time. So I think there are lots of folks I know throughout this world who are making a difference. I remember my uncle Brent. He was a pastor in Glen Rose, Texas, for many years. He's passed now. But when I think of him and I think about like what he did at his church in Glen Rose, he would go down to Juarez, Mexico on a regular basis and feed the children, right? He was someone who lived voraciously for Christ, and I know he was a dedicated Texas Baptist, to be sure, but he also really wanted to fulfill the call of Christ through his service, and I think he loved God by loving others in that way, because I think so often we think that Jesus is held in our mouths, but I think we communicate Jesus with our hands more so, and I think my Uncle Brent often was able to do that.
Yeah. Your uncle was a pretty great guy. Just as an aside, he and my father-in-law knew each other when my father-in-law was pastor just up the road from him, and then my father-in-law became the director of missions. Yeah, so small world.
That's it.
Yeah. So I would assume that there are right ways, beneficial ways to help those in need, like those who are looking for housing, need housing. And there are wrong ways or problematic ways to quote unquote help. So what's an example of something that you've seen in your work in law and now you're in real estate that you would characterize as a problematic way to help someone in need or someone who needs housing?
Yeah, I mean, so one thing I've thought about, and this is something that happens in many communities. In fact, it has a name, right? So NIMBYism, right? So it's not in my backyard kind of idea. I think particularly what I've seen is too often with Christians, it's that idea of like, yeah, hey, we really believe that this affordable housing should be built, or that this supportive housing for the homeless should be built, but it shouldn't be built in my neighborhood. And I think we see that politically kind of come to fruition a lot, but it also happens in the Christian world a lot, where it's sort of like, hey, these folks, yeah, they should come to church, but they should sit over there, right? Or they don't quite smell in this way. In fact, that's one of the things I think about is the question is, if everybody looks like you, if everybody smells like you, if everybody talks like you in church, I don't know that we're fulfilling the kingdom of God in that sense. So part of that is being active, figuring out a way to, hey, actually, it's not in my backyard. When are we going to come to the point as Christians to say yes in my backyard, right? So, hey, how do we as Christians build affordable housing? In fact, we're blessed right now. My wife and I, we go to an African Methodist Episcopal church now, not a Baptist church anymore, but the church we go to actually built affordable housing years and years ago. In fact, it received some HUD subsidies and oversights and things like that. And it's a church that said, hey, you know what? We are going to not just invite folks to church. We want to build a place for them to live. And it's one of the things that makes me so happy. And it's a tiny little church that's still there. And they built this housing, and they have a whole housing corporation that runs this affordable housing for a little community right across the street from our church in Denver, Colorado. And I think churches that are doing that, building that housing, but not just building housing for folks who they like or for folks who already come to the church, but really for folks who are in need. I think that's the kind of housing, that's the kind of support that we need as communities and across the board. And how do we do that in our own backyard and advocate for that? And so figuring out how to do that and move forward, I think is super important. And I think conversely, right? So you talk about things that we don't do well. Again, I think it's that idea of, hey, yeah, we should advocate, but we should advocate for somebody else to do it. right? So one thing is I remember growing up where you don't sit around and wait for the chairs to be put away after the church service, or in the fellowship hall, you have to help do it. And I think that's part of it, right? It's every little act of service we can do, and that kind of goes the spectrum. I think too often we think, okay, hey, if I give, if I donate to this organization or I tithe, that's enough. I think tithing has always encompassed a lot more than our wallets, right? So how do we actually go and volunteer and help feed the homeless, and whatever that means? And then I also think we also need to engage with our political and social systems as well, right? So we sit here and we pretend as though as people, that's all you have to do. You donate, maybe you volunteer for a little bit. I think you have to realize, and challenge the structures that exist that have created homelessness, right? So folks that are mentally ill on the street, why is that happening? Why is that happening in our society? Why can't we find a way to fund the services that those folks need to find the housing they need? So I think it's a multi-pronged what to do and how to do it at the same time. Yeah.
Yeah. Because another thing too is that poverty very rarely is something that happens all of a sudden. For many people, maybe for the majority of people who are in poverty, this is something that's maybe even been generational, or maybe it is a life choice at some point along the way, but that life choice is not sort of divorced from other factors that were going on. But at any rate, however a person finds themselves in a position of being in poverty, it wasn't something that just necessarily happened overnight in most cases. And so it would seem to me that there is plenty of opportunity for churches, for Christians, for lots of different people, Christian or not, to be engaged in some way along that road, regardless of what a person's political leanings are. There's opportunity for everyone to be a part of, well, to use a phrase, fixing the problem.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I mean, I think we go back to the Good Samaritan. The Good Samaritan didn't come across the guy and be like, well, you should have been on this road to begin with. It was dangerous. You should have known better, right? I think what Jesus is teaching us is it doesn't matter why they got on the road they got on. If they're hurting and suffering, it's our job to help our neighbor.
Yeah. Yeah, and the Good Samaritan, then when he decided to help the guy, he put himself out. I mean, he picked the guy up. He didn't just throw some money down and say, when the food truck comes by, you can get something. But he put himself really at risk. He was going to end up slowing himself down to get this guy somewhere where he could get some help, which would, make him a target too. He gets this guy to a place where he can lay his head and be sheltered and reasonably safe. And he doesn't stop there. He comes back. He says, I'll be back to make sure, everything is as it's supposed to be. Of course, we're paraphrasing a little bit, but it seems to me that the kind of work that you've been doing for quite a while now, that your family's been a part of, and that you're talking about, this is not a one and done kind of thing. This is for a lot of people, this is a life of, well, maybe it ought to be for all of us, I don't know, but it's a life of being engaged where the hurt is and where the need is. Is that saying too much?
No, I wouldn't say that. I think, as Jesus pointed out, the poor will always be amongst us, right? So I think that means that the struggle will always continue.
I wish Jesus wasn't so pessimistic about that,
Yeah, well,
yeah, right. Right.
We
right.
we need to let him know. Hey, I think maybe realistic is probably the better way to put it, right? So,
right.
given the state of humanity, right? So there's no question. Yeah, I mean, I think that's the reality, which is I think my own faith has struggled with that, which is like how, frankly, to be completely honest, is like, how dare God allow this to happen, or create or make a creation that can make these choices about each other, right? So it makes it really tough for me as a Christian to move forward, because I'm like, that doesn't seem fair, right? And we assume that God knows all things at all times, and all these things that we've been taught, and it just seems like, well, that's not a great system that you created, God. So and I understand, right? We have choices and things like that, but I was like, we could have. I think reducing some of these choices would have made sense. And that's always been a faith struggle for me, for sure.
Yeah. That's a tough one. I mean, really?
Yeah. No, it's really tough. I think, especially when you look and you think, well, wait a second, why is it this way? Why do we have these choices even? And sure, I understand what I was taught in Sunday school and by reading the Word and things like that. But at some level, I think, I don't know, maybe I would have picked a different system. But maybe that's my lawyerly nature. I'm not sure which. But
Yeah.
Well, as we come to the end, as you look forward, look ahead, maybe in the near future, what's something hopeful that you see for this kind of work?
I think we are hopefully becoming more aware of what it means to serve folks that are experiencing homelessness and housing instability, and understanding that it's more than just one response, right? There's no we are in the times of I don't know when the podcast will play, but we're in the times of the coronavirus, right? COVID-19 vaccine. There's no vaccine, unfortunately, for homelessness, right? So it is a full systemic, right, issue that involves us personally. But I think we are becoming aware that there's not one government program that solves it, right? Nor is there one charitable donation that solves it. It's got to be a decision by each one of us, and yet a decision for us as a society to make the difference, and to really help those that are struggling in this world. And I hope that we can all be a part of the struggle for housing, as opposed to judgment or decision making for other folks.
Jesse, thank you for spending this time with me.
Thank you so much for having me. It's just good to see you.
Yeah, it's good to see you too.
Just because a person follows Jesus doesn't mean that person is perfect. Following Jesus is a lifetime of growing more like Him. Likewise, while there are followers who are more mature than others, who have spent more time growing close to Jesus than other followers, there are no followers of Jesus who are better than others. If you aren't on the way with Jesus, we invite you to check out the Follow Jesus page on the Baptist Standard website at baptiststandard.com/Follow Jesus to learn more about becoming a follower of Him. If you are on the way with Jesus, we hope that this podcast has encouraged you to grow more like Him. I'm Eric Black, editor of the Baptist Standard, and I'm glad you've been with us today.